What's new in Active Directory management? Boy, I'll tell you, of all of the new and improved features in Windows Server 2008 R2, the ones that I personally like the most deal with day-to-day Active Directory management tasks. It's clear to me anyway that the Microsoft Windows Server team put a lot of thought and effort into the question of how can we make day-to-day AD management easier for the Windows administrator. To that end, we're going to concentrate on 5 really nifty technologies and enhancements. First, enhancements to the Server Manager graphical user interface. We'll then look at a new GUI called the Active Directory Administrative Center, or ADAC, that again is going to drastically, I think, improve your life and shorten your learning curve in mastering AD management. We'll then turn our attention to security by examining the Active Directory Best Practices Analyzer. We'll learn about the Active Directory Recycle Bin, such a great improvement over the RTM level deleted object techniques like authoritative restore and tombstone animation. We'll learn more about those in just a little bit. And finally, a huge headache solver, managed service accounts. We'll learn why they're important, what they are, and how they work. Let's get to work. Server Manager enhancements. Now, if you've spent any time at all with Windows Server 2008 RTM, and I trust you have, you're familiar with the Server Manager console. This is a Microsoft Management Console interface that some administrators love, some administrators don't. I kind of started off not liking this tool, and then I came to enjoy it a great deal. As it happened, when Windows Server 2008 was first released, Server Manager was really sluggish. It took forever to load, and frankly, I just was so used to opening up individual MMC consoles to manage server roles like DNS, DHCP, IIS, Active Directory users, and computers that I didn't want to bother with Server Manager. Nonetheless, besides being a really great aggregate of your most commonly used MMC tools that map to your installed server roles and features, the other main reason why we use Server Manager is to manage those server roles and features. Now, some folks including myself, get a little confused as to the distinction between the server role and the feature, and as I'm going to show you in a little bit, with PowerShell, there's not even a distinction between the server role and the feature in terms of adding or removing either of these from a PowerShell environment. Bottom line, just so we have the basic working definition of each in our mind as we go forward, a server role is an installable component that's generally considered to be a server-wide function. In other words, we bring up a separate piece of hardware, or maybe a virtual machine, devoted to a particular task. Now, that task could be Internet Information Services, web application publishing. It could be Active Directory domain services and the domain controller role. These are pretty heavy-hitting capabilities that if you can spare the hardware to isolate server roles on separate machines, it's suggested you do so. By contrast, features are installable units of functionality that don't necessarily need their own server. It gets fuzzy though because some installable components that show up in the features list are heavy hitting enough to where you'd want to devote a box to it. Bottom line, friends, don't get all tied in a knot intellectually over the distinction between a server role and a feature. The key to passing your exams and the key to understanding use of Server Manager in practice is simply finding where to go to install or uninstall that component. If it shows up under server role, cool. If it shows up under features, cool. End of story. Now, Server Manager graphical user interface does have a command line version. In my 649 training, if my memory serves, and I'm quite sure it does, I gave you a primer on how to use Server Manager cmd.exe. Now, this is just a compiled executable command line program called a console program, actually, that does some of the things that the Server Manager console can do, namely installing and removing server roles and features. We have to understand the basic scheme, though, that Microsoft has gradually been incorporating PowerShell functionality into their products, their server and client products. To that end, know that Server Manager gives us a number of PowerShell commandlets that enable us to script, automate, and otherwise control through a PowerShell script tasks that we would ordinarily require several clicks to get through going through the Server Manager console GUI. Specifically, I'm thinking of PowerShell commandlets like add Windows feature, get Windows feature, and remove Windows feature. Those are commandlets that allow you to add, query, or remove, respectively, not only features, but server roles. Hence, again, running into a little bit of potential confusion with nomenclature. So know that we have the ability to do server role management from PowerShell. Know also that in Windows Server 2008 R2, we have complete integration between the Server Manager console and the Active Directory Best Practices Analyzer. In fact, as you know, with Server Manager, you can view all your server roles, and not all server roles, but a good number of them, including Hyper-V and IIS, have built-in BPAs, or Best Practice Analyzers, that you can run directly from Server Manager. Now, I'm going to hold off any further discussion of the best practice analyzers for now because we're devoting a separate slide to that a little bit later in this nugget. So hang on to your hat with that if you would. Another enhancement in Server Manager is Remote MMC. This is R2 only, of course. New feature, and you're probably accustomed to, as I am, opening up, say, a blank MMC console and then loading in snap-ins that map to the tools that you need to use to get your work done. For instance, you might be doing some work on your IIS web servers and managing digital certificates, web certificates. You could, from your Windows 7 client workstation, as long as you had your RSAT tools, your remote server administrative tools loaded, load up those snap-ins into the MMC console, and away you go. Server Manager is MMC, but it historically was at the same time not MMC, in as much as the tree view was fixed. You couldn't just arbitrarily make a remote connection to a snap-in on a remote server. Well, fortunately and finally in R2, we have the ability to do remote MMCing from Server Manager. I think that's an excellent value add and should allow for a greater adoption of Server Manager by Windows administrators. All right, next we have in R2 the sconfig utility. Now, you know, in Windows Server 2008 RTM and R2, upon initial installation of the product, you get a splash screen that gives you choices to do your initial setup, right? Choose a time zone, select a host name, these sorts of things. Now, Server Core, as you know, is an installation method that involves practically no graphical user interface, so therefore we don't have that initial configuration tasks window. We don't have a Server Manager GUI in Server Core. So how do you get things done? Well, up to R2, it involved knowing a bunch of fairly arcane command line utilities. sconfig is an addition in Windows Server 2008 R2 that provides, again, a command line based interface, but a much cleaner way to do your initial configuration tasks on a new R2 Server Core box. Remember also that you can log on to a standard edition of Windows Server 2008 and use remote MMCing to manage a Server Core box. But sometimes you're right at the keyboard and you need to get things done locally, and sconfig is a good answer to that. Finally, in Server Manager, and this is something that you just should familiarize yourself with, and we'll do that in our first demo, is look for new or renamed roles and features. Hopefully you're familiar with the built-in server roles and features in Windows Server 2008 RTM. R2 gives us some changes. There's been some renames. Microsoft historically, unfortunately, is known for rebranding products. One that just comes to mind immediately is the movement from Microsoft Windows Terminal Services to Remote Desktop Services, or RDS. Now let's shift our consideration to the Best Practices Analyzer, or BPAs. Now, Best Practice Analyzers represent scanners, basically. They're scanners that will look for best practice violations, okay? Now, if you don't know what a best practice is, that statement doesn't mean anything, does it? A best practice, or as I denote it, a BP, is a suggested configuration. And that suggested configuration is suggested by Microsoft. And the reason why I think you should take those best practice suggestions seriously is because as a first-party provider who eats their own dog food, in other words, they actually consume and use the technologies that they build, Microsoft, above anyone else really, has a good handle on how their products should best be configured for maximum security, maximum performance, and maximum reliability. Okay? You should also know that BPA is a suite of scanners, many of which you can download separately from the Microsoft download site. However, as of Windows Server 2008 R2, many server roles are covered within Server Manager, and we have Best Practices Analyzer integration directly in the product. It makes it very convenient. There are still separate Best Practice Analyzers for Microsoft SharePoint, SQL Server 2008, etc. that, again, you can download from Microsoft, and they work the very same way. So, as I said, BPA is a per server role scanner, and the report that it comes back with is divided into the following categories. There's going to be security metrics, performance metrics, general configuration metrics, policy metrics, and operational metrics. And it's really nice from within Server Manager to just run a quick scan per server role and follow those suggestions. Best Practice Analyzer reminds me of a more integrated version of a standalone tool called the MBSA, the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer. And I think it's a really nifty tool, and we'll take a look at it in the upcoming demo. The final new feature in R2 that we'll look at before that aforementioned first demo is the Active Directory Administrative Center, also called ADAC. Now, you could look at ADAC as a replacement for ADUC. I'm not talking about a mallard here. I'm not talking about a canvasback. I'm talking about the Active Directory Users and Computers MMC console that used the old school monolithic Microsoft Management Console architecture. Now, whereas Active Directory Administrator looks a lot like Active Directory Users and Computers, under the hood there's much different stuff going on. Specifically, I need you to understand that the Active Directory Administrative Center is a PowerShell host application. In other words, this application is a graphical user interface that allows us as Active Directory administrators to run queries, put searches in search boxes, to hit command buttons, to make graphical user interface control choices. But under the hood, you have PowerShell commandlets running. This host application is very similar to the Microsoft Exchange management tool, which is the very same idea. There's just a GUI layer on top of raw PowerShell commandlets. Because of that, because there's less code involved in terms of monolithic compiled code, you should find that Active Directory Administrator functions much faster, physically faster, than Active Directory Users and Computers. But you should also find that day-to-day Active Directory management operations are faster as well. Specifically, searching for Active Directory objects and the property views are much easier to use. I mean, think of it this way. You need to modify some attribute of Joe or Jane user in your domain. What are you going to do? You're going to open up Active Directory Users and Computers, and then if you even know that there is a find function, you'll use that find function, make sure that the find filter is set correctly, locate the user account, double left click that account, and you're greeted with, depending upon how much you've extended your Active Directory schema, perhaps a couple dozen property sheet tabs. And then there's the question, how do I find the tab that contains the attribute that I want to change? You see what I'm saying? I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised when we look at Active Directory Administrative Center on how faster the interface is as far as locating user accounts, locating computer accounts, locating group accounts, all this. And as I said, the property view is much easier on the eyes and much faster. Lastly, you have the ability to customize the interface to suit your administrative style. Really great stuff. Before we go on, I want to say something about offline domain join, because I'm going to put an asterisk here. This is a very hot button topic that you're likely to see a question or so on your 649 test. Offline domain join is a really cool new feature of Windows Server 2008 R2. I'm putting it on the same slide as Active Directory Administrative Center because they both deal, of course, with day-to-day Active Directory operations. What this is it's a way to solve the problem of needing a Windows domain member workstation or prospective domain member workstation to be online. Traditionally, the way it would work is maybe you blast out an image to a Windows 7 desktop, and of course, when you initially install, unless your deployment software automates the process of joining a domain, you start off in a work group, don't you? And then in order to create a domain computer account on your domain controller and officially join that workstation to the domain, there needs to be an exchange of domain administrative credentials, and there just needs to be a network pipe between an available domain controller and that workstation. The workflow for offline domain join, in other words, where your Windows 7 workstation